Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists. Again, today you'll find out they got it spot on correct, as well as the majority of the ministers out of New England, in particular, of our founding era. Now, I just want to let you know that last week was one of those busy weeks and involved in a great project called Liberty Camp USA. In Liberty Camp USA, that's where Sam Adams really comes out. This is a camp for second graders through seventh grade. It's a day camp, so usually from about 9 o'clock in the morning till 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And there are various sessions that the kids participate in to take and learn about the truth of our foundational history. I was up in Lake County, Ohio this past week, and there they had 80-some campers, which is really a nice large group. Next week, I'll be in Geauga County. Well, not myself, actually, but Sam Adams. And in Geauga County, Ohio, where I am hearing there is over 90-some campers that will be in attendance. It's a delight to be able to interact with the kids. There are a number of reenactors, a number of different scenarios every day that are changed up for each of those age categories. Again, second graders through seventh graders that take and go through a week's worth of learning and understanding the truths of our founding era. So I wanted to give that a pitch. You can find out more about them at libertycampusa.com, I believe. So go check that out, and they can always use your assistance as well as looking at doing Liberty Camp somewhere in your state, in your area in particular. So with that, we want to take a look at the program for this week, Govern Well or Be Judged, and then looking at your suffrage, and not suffering, but the SUFFRAG, meaning your vote. And we are coming upon election time again. We have various elections happening throughout the U.S. on special elections in August, early August voting. We have a constitutional amendment here in Ohio that's very, very critical to pass to stop the large progressive socialist, communist, evil, moneyed interest in changing the Ohio Constitution. I talked on that a couple of weeks ago. But what's important is that the founders had a lot to say about your vote and how critical that is. So for today's program, I am going to refer you to three different sources to consider. The first one is Richard Henry Lee and his two Federal Farmer articles of 1788. The second is we're going to delve into Samuel Cheever, who's a pastor of a church in Marblehead, and this is a 1712 sermon titled God's Sovereign Government Among the Nations. This is the root of it all, folks. We take and we look, and I keep bringing this up, is we're looking for political solutions. Yeah, there are political solutions, but if you don't have this foundation, God's sovereign government among the nations, you cannot govern well. You're going to govern. It'll be okay, but will it be well? Will it be for the welfare of all the people? Doubt it. And then just to touch out of just one paragraph, one instance, one question, we're going to go to that, what was it? An article, actually more of a response that was written in, oh golly, we have to go back, all the way back until, 1579 and that being a defense of liberty against tyrants. We're going to just look at a portion of the first question because it's critical when we think about governing well, when we think about what it means to elect the proper people, when we consider, and that's what's really important right now, how do we vote and know how to vote on issues, let alone proper people? And we have to clearly understand by both the sermon that I already mentioned to you by Samuel Cheever and this one by Junius Brutus, a defense of liberty against tyrants, is that if you don't get it right, you're going to be judged. If you personally do not have it right, there's judgment. I didn't give you the reference in the newsletter. You can go look for yourself. But you have to clearly understand that God holds all of nature. He holds the wind. He holds the rain. He holds and controls and allows for what people call Mother Nature to have a judgment effect. Now, a lot of churches aren't going to say that. A lot of modern pastors won't even touch that. But, somebody said, the irony of what happened in North Carolina was at Rocky Mountain, North Carolina, where a Pfizer plant was hit by a tornado. It collapsed, a major Pfizer plant there. And the article link is in samueladamsreturns.net in the newsletter for this week. So go check that out. But the fact of the matter is, we can think all we want that the smoke for the most of the United States is receiving, especially us in the Midwest and those on the East Coast coming out of Canada. Oh, that was all global warming. Nah. If you take and you go research it, you'll find that it is highly probable that those were simultaneously set wildfires. And the Canadian government under Trudeau is doing nothing really to fight them. He's, just allowing nature to take its course. That's not true. They're allowing them to happen for, I guess you could say, nefarious reasons. But with that, the fact is that the sovereign God, God's sovereign government, the sovereign God has allowed that as a form of judgment upon the nations, which he does. And we can read about that more, but let me get to the beginning of this for you, and we'll talk about it a little bit in each instance. But with the importance of the elections coming up, I wanted to touch on the idea of the suffrage. Your vote means nothing if you're under the judgment of God. If a nation, if a state, if a community is under the judgment of God, there's going to be corruption in the election process. There will be, because men are corruptible. Men want to build their own kingdoms in so many ways, unless they come under the authority of the living God. So Richard Henry Lee, he wrote in 1788 that the advocates of the Constitution say we must trust to the administration and elect good men for representatives. I admit that in forming a social compact, we can fix only general principles, and of necessity must trust something to the wisdom and integrity of the administration. But the question is, do we not trust too much? And to men also placed in the vortex of temptation to lay hold of proffered advantages for themselves and their connections, and to oppress the body of the people. I also refer you to that book on analyzing the administrative state. I highly recommend that you go there. We're going to talk about that if we have time to. But Richard Henry Lee continues and says it is of one thing to authorize a well-organized legislature to make laws under the restraints of a well-guarded constitution, which our constitutions are no longer well-guarded. We see that. And another to assemble a few men and to tell them to do what they please. And we've done that by virtue of the fact that we are underrepresented. Those that go to the legislature do not just what they please, they do what who? The lobbyists please. I am not the more shaken in my principles or disposed to despair of the cause of liberty, because some of our able men have adopted the yielding language of non-resistance, and writers dare insult the people with the signatures of Caesar, Mark Antony, and of other tyrants, because I see even moderate and amenable men forced to let go of monarchy in 1775, still in love with it. Globalism. Globalism is global leadership. Globalism is that monarchy that we fought against and won over in 1775. And they're still in love with it. To use the simile of our countrymen, when the political pot boils, catch this one. I really want you to catch this. When the political pot boils, the scum will often get uppermost and make its appearance. What do we have just all over, not just Washington, D.C., but all over a number of the state capitals, and even down to the county level? We have that scum of a pot boiling over. I believe the people of America, when they shall fully understand any political subject brought before them, and we're seeing a lot of that coming out, will talk in a very different style and use the manly language of freedom. Now, when we think about that, and we think about the scum that is there, isn't it amazing to understand that this was almost prophetic, if you will? Now, Lee summarizes the whole thing in a section here, and he goes, on the whole, it appears to me to be almost a self-evident position that when we call on 30 or 40,000 inhabitants to unite, and in our case now 1 million to 1.2 million, unite to give their votes for one man, it will be uniformly impracticable for them to unite in any man, in any men, let me make that plural, except for those few who have become eminent for their civil or military rank or their popular legal abilities. It will be found totally impracticable for men in the private walks of life, except in the profession of law, to become conspicuous enough to attract the notice of so many electors and have their suffrage. So what he was indicating there is, as now, Joe Plumber has a heck of a time getting elected. It's only the elite, the money interest, and he even laughs about it to an extent. Lawyers, the legal people. Well, Sam Adams obviously recognized a lot of this. He and Richard Henry Lee were really good friends. And if you go to SamuelAdamsReturns.com to today's newsletter, you'll see in Sam Adams' wisdom an interaction he had and a letter he wrote to Richard Henry Lee. Come on back for the next segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, you got it. You can finish the statement for me, and this is Tom Navolis, your host. Don't remember if I introduced myself in the last segment or not. But just to finish off the idea of you giving your suffrage, otherwise you're going to suffer if you don't do it with wisdom, I wanted to take a little notation, if you will, from Samuel Cheever in 1712 in his sermon. And you're not going to find these types of comments in too many pulpits in America today. You're really not. Most, I'm not going down that path right now. You know where I stand on it. But let's listen to Reverend Cheever. He says this about the third branch of the exhortation, and this is all part of his sermon. To the representatives, so those that you elect. And worthy gentlemen concerned in the government, worthy gentlemen, bureaucrats, any of those that are involved in the political system, if you will. Remember, you have a great trust committed to you. Let me request that you would be faithful to God and his people. What was lodged formerly in the hands of a considerable body of people is now devolved upon your care and prudence. Be careful then in your choice to choose such as are really friends to the government. I mean, to the great God and Lord of all. Choose none who are disaffected to God's government. Do not imagine your suffrages are your own. And if you're a believer, if you're a Christian, and you understand fundamental Reformed biblical doctrine, you know even your vote belongs to God. And that's the key element. So he goes on to say, there is a God among you, to whom you stand accountable for this and every day's work. Let all sinister ends and by respects be laid aside. You must choose for God, as Jehoshaphat told his judges. They judge not for man, but for the Lord. 2 Chronicles 19:6. For it must be remembered you are under God's government. Choosing for God, choose able men, and such as will do good service for God and his people. And remember, the laws of God's realm are by a multitude miserably neglected, and you are entrusted with the execution of them. You have done well to give your civil sanction, and if anything more can be done, it will be very pleasing in the Lord's sight. For the suppressing those gross vices which abound so much among us, we have indeed good laws against vice and immorality, but there is certainly a fault among us, that they are not better executed. There's a lot in there. And there's a lot in there for today. You see, the pulpits don't even remind representatives that they are under the sovereignty and dominion of God. Then that what they do legislatively is to take and represent God as well as then the people. That's fundamental, even for those that'll argue out of Romans 8 that we should have peace. And the only way we have that peace of the Lord is that we have to legislate for it. And as he brings out here, very critical in the sight of the Lord, you got to suppress the gross vices which abound so much among us. There's laws there. But now There's laws for immorality and laws for vice. So guess what? That leads to judgment. Every city in the United States that is not prosecuting proper crimes, theft, murder, all of those that are true criminal activity, well, they're under judgment. The judgment comes, come on, think about it. It's simple logic. If you do not detain and you do not punish, then God punishes. If you are not the agent of God as a political leader or as a societal leader or as a church leader, then God punishes. That's all throughout this sermon by Cheever. Very interesting. And what we're seeing in our present day is a backwards implementation. So we're not executing, and he said, but there is certainly a fault among us that the laws against vice and immorality are not better executed. But you want to know something? When we take and we look at where are the pulpits that are teaching the application of this, of God's sovereignty in every aspect of life, that means work, that means government, that means, yes, family, that means personally. What we end up having is that we're seeing in modern evangelical Christianity in particular is, and some of even Catholicism and some of the other so-called Christian offshoots, which there is only one Christian church under Christ, period. So not really any offshoots, but they claim to be. The point is that the sovereignty of Christ is extensible over every aspect of life. And I call it because of the way that evangelicals over the many years that I have attended different evangelical churches, different denominations and non-denominational, in particular, charismatics in particular, so personalize biblical application that they're quasi-narcissistic. Cheever's sermon extends to the effect that it is God's sovereignty over all things. In our present time, we have perverted the laws such that in the case, and I'm going to just flat out say it, that in the case of the J6 people, as well as with now Donald Trump, they're going back, the DOJ is going back to post-Civil War times, using laws on the books and manipulating them in a way that they were never designed for, to convict political enemies. I commented about this on my audio introduction to Bastiat's The Law 14 years ago. I predicted that archaic laws, and there's over 10,000 plus laws, closer to 20,000 in the federal code alone, which could be used when convenient to attack those that don't fit your political positioning. Well, how do you govern good? What is it? Govern well? Where do we look for that? And that's where I brought out, and there it is in the newsletter, of the 3 references that are there. And I wanted to take you through that journey a little bit, and we're not going to have time, as usual, to get to it all. But in Samuel Cheever's message, it is most certain that God's government is the easiest government. His laws are the most just and equal. And if this be demonstrated, sound reason as well as conscience in every man will give its suffrage, that's his vote, that God should govern in chief over all. And all deference and submission should be given to him above and before any other. It's so equal that God reasons the case in Micah 6, 2 and 3, and would have his people testify against him if they knew any just cause to be wary of him. But there's not. And then in Jeremiah 2:5, would have Israel tell what iniquity they found in him to go far from him. God governs indeed by law and will uphold the honor of his government, not let his authority be trampled upon, but will punish the contempt of it. You have to understand that there is judgment if we do not govern well. And punishment isn't just after you die. Punishment is here and now. Judgment is here and now. It's all throughout Scripture. It's all throughout history, where nations disappear off the face of the earth. Quite frankly, they became judged by the sovereign God. But he imposes no grievous burdens, as men sometimes do. That's Luke 11:46. Christ's commands are not grievous. 1 John 5:3. And hence Christ assures us that his yoke is easy and will be so where it is lined with love. And a new nature given with our blessed Lord hath purchased by his blood, and is one among all things delivered by the Father, as is hinted in Matthew 11:27. He being made of God to us sanctification as well as righteousness, as we find inserted in 1 Corinthians 1:30. It is only, therefore, corrupt nature that will complain, not grace. So all of us sinners, all of us corrupted, all of the perverted out there, they're the ones complaining about good government. Think about that. Think about that today. They complain about good and proper government because why? They're corrupted in their nature. And these laws of God's government are the most beneficial, useful, and every way profitable to the subject. Godliness being profitable to all things, having the promise of this life as well as that to come, so that upon the whole it may be well called a reasonable service. That's Romans 12:1. And the easiest in the world, and here I might summon the experience of Christ's faithful subject David, invites the faithful in Psalm 34:8. O taste and see that the Lord is good. What sweetness did he find in God's laws? Read Psalm 19:10. They were sweeter than honey. And Psalm 119:16. And it was his delight. And so on. And as God hath among us numbered the faithful and loyal subjects, so there are such that have lived under both governments. Once were in a state of nature, now in a state of grace. Others have had dominion over you, but through grace you have submitted to God's name and his only. Surely you can speak well of his government and would not change this God, nor yield yourself to be servants of sin and Satan again. My friends, there's so much more in Cheever's message, but what he comes down to is the application. All of this you don't want to be under the tyranny of bondage of sin and Satan, which is the evil that we see today, but you have to have the application of the truth. And we don't see a lot of that coming to us from the pulpits. We don't understand what it means to apply in every aspect of life, let alone politically, to vote appropriately. Come on back for the third segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third segment. This is Tom Navolis, your host, and I highly recommend that all of those who have only listened to the first and third segment go and listen to the second segment at samueladamsreturns.net. You can find it there or wherever else the podcast is delivered, or YouTube or Brighteon or Rumble, where you can see my smiling face as well. So with that, I want to continue on where we may be judged. I want to cover that just a titch more, in that many pastors, especially as I've talked about earlier, is that the evangelicals don't teach of God's judgment in our modern times. They take the Pfizer incident in North Carolina as, oh yeah, a tornado just blew through. They don't take it as, maybe God, and let me take that back. Not maybe God, but how about God putting his finger on Pfizer? Isn't that interesting? How about the Northeast under all the heavy flooding that they're experiencing because they walked away from their Puritan biblical Reformation roots and are some of the most perverse states in the whole United States? Think about that. Oh, the people suffer. The people suffer because they violate the sovereignty of God. And, as I mentioned earlier in the last segment, God's not going to let his government, his rules, his laws be mocked or made to nothing. No, preachers need to start to understand what is God's judgment as it's biblically correct and historically shown. So, based on that, it's our personal sins that contribute to all of this. And it's based on what decisions we're going to make, what vote. What is your suffrage? Who are you voting for? Richard Henry Lee talks a lot about that. But here's what Samuel Cleaver talks about in application. And we got to get to the application. We may hence learn that if God be the supreme governor and hath, as you have heard, such an indubitable right to govern the world, that sin, and especially willful sin, every perversion is willful sin. Every transgender is willful sin. That's what it is. Their will over God's will. They were created a man or a woman, and they are willfully despising and detesting the creator of them. Interesting. So he goes on to say, such an indubitable right to govern the world, that sin, and especially willful sin, whatever advocates it may have in the world, is certainly the most malignant and mischievous evil that can possibly be. The laws of God's realm are so holy, just, and good that sin, which is the transgression of such laws, must needs be very evil and will be very bitter at last, how light a matter soever men make it. You have to read the rest of it on the sermon yourself. The references there at samueladamsreturns.net. But God's judgment is not only here on earth, but it's eternal for those that do not submit to the sovereignty of Christ. So anyway, I gave you a quick look there at that Pfizer article, and I reference it. But let's get to the question. Let's get to that interesting question that I brought up as part of the references, the three references. So giving your suffrage is a fixed principle, period. End of story. Allowing illegals to vote is destructive to the first principle of a free people. It's destructive. It destroys it. They have no right whatsoever to participate in our elections. Anybody that does that is designing the destruction of constitutionalism. Richard Henry Lee noted this in his 12 January 1788 article. It is well observed by Montesquieu that in Republican governments, the forms of election are fundamental, and that it is an essential part of a social compact to ascertain by whom, to whom, when, and what manner suffrages are to be given. You get that part? By whom, to whom, when? Whenever we find the regulation of elections have not been carefully fixed by the Constitution, or the principles of them, we constantly see the legislature's modifying its own form and changing the spirit of the government to answer partial purposes. We're seeing that all over the United States since the 2020 election. Not only are we seeing it from the legislatures, we're seeing it from the courts and the administrative state of the various states. By the proposed plan, being the Constitution of 1787, it is fixed that the qualifications of the electors, that means you and I as citizens, of the federal representatives shall be the same as those of the electors of the state representatives. Though these vary in some several states, the electors are fixed and designated. Get that? They're fixed and designated. No illegals. It's in the federal Constitution. Richard Henry Lee admits that component as much as he disliked anything about the Senate and representation. He knows it is fixed, and anyone that allows for illegals to vote are destroying this country. So what about that? So during that significant debate in 1579, the Liberty response to the conditions at hand, which are similar to ours, both religiously and politically, is that great treatise, A Defense of Liberty Against Tyrants. So I want to begin just with that first question. Whether subjects are obligated to obey rulers who issue commands contrary to the law of God. Well, we were hearing about the sovereignty and the law of God from Cheever earlier. But here we have, as Brutus writes this, I will establish our present time by reviewing segments of that full response. And when you go to the newsletter, I italicize, I bold throughout all of these. But there are many rulers in these days who call themselves Christian. Look at that. Stop for a second and think about even in your local office. They call themselves Christian, who arrogantly assume that their power is limited by no one, not even God. And they surround themselves with flatterers who adore them as gods upon the earth. Not to mention the many others who, out of fear, constraint, either believe or appear to believe that rulers ought to be obeyed in all things and by all men. Think about that in the evangelical churches who say, well, Romans 8 says we got to do this. Therefore, seeing the unhappiness of these times is such that there is nothing so firm, certain, or pure that it is not shaken, disgraced, or polluted, that anyone who shall thoroughly consider these things will admit that this question is not only most profitable, but also most necessary. For my own part, when I consider the cause of the many calamities that have affected Christendom lately, I am reminded of the words of the prophet Hosea. The princes of Judah were like those that remove a boundary. On them I will pour out my wrath like water. Ephraim is oppressed, crushed in judgment, because he was determined to follow the commandments of men. There you go. He's pouring out his wrath like water. Hey, New England, you got a wave of water upon you? Here you see the sin of the rulers and the people fully displayed in these two verses. These rulers exceeded their authority, not being content with the authority which the Almighty and all good God has given them, but seek to usurp that sovereignty which he has reserved to himself over all men. And not being content with absolute power over the lives and property of their subjects, these tyrants seize for themselves the right to rule over their consciences as well. Isn't that today the thought police? All of social media thought, the censoring. They want to rule over your conscience, over which the authority belongs to Jesus Christ alone. Holding the earth not great enough for their ambition, they want to climb and conquer heaven itself. The people, on the other hand, follow the commandments of men when they yield to these rulers who command them, which is against the law of God. Thus the people burn incense and adore these earthly gods, and instead of resisting them, they instead permit them to usurp the place of God, apparently untroubled by the giving to Caesar that which belongs properly to God. Okay, there you go. That's the question. There's an answer. There's a whole definition of what is important. And we see that is the common nature of those who become, what is said, tyrants, because they do not submit to the authority of God. Even those that are elected or go as candidates, I'm a Christian, and yet inside they're tyrants when they have that opportunity in the offices they pursued. And you gave your vote, your suffrage, therefore you suffer. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there's so much to be said here, and I said we needed to wrap it up with action. The action item here is to know those that you are going to vote for, to give your suffrage towards, to understand the issues, to delve into them from a biblical, historical perspective. If you don't understand the biblical, historical perspective, ask, seek true pastors that are teaching it. If you think I have any value in that respect or can lead you to those that can give that, I highly recommend go ahead and email me at tom@samueladamsreturns.com. And I will point you in a direction that may be of assistance to you so that you can find the truth. Vet the candidates, vet the issues. There's means and mechanisms to do that. And if any elected person votes on any one item that violates the laws of God, get rid of them. Find someone else that will run for office, that will stand for the truths that Richard Henry Lee talked about, that Samuel Cheever talked about. that we read about in Sam Adams' writings, as well as standing up against tyrants. Well, my friends, I have a few references there for you and some articles for you to go check out for this week. So come on back next week when Sam Adams returns. And yes, those anti-federalists got it right.